be talking about the invention of the Braam, or how Hans Zimmer changed film scores. And I'm Meredith, as I'm sure all of you know. So let's get into it. So this is kind of a general overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to give a brief history of Western film scores. Then I'm going to get into a kind of a short bibliography of Hans Zimmer. Who is he? How did he get into composition? I'm going to talk about the infamous Braam. And then I'm going to get into the analysis of Interstellar's main theme. So, history of Western film scores. So, prior to cinema, many performances and people on stage were accompanied by music. Since the time of the Romans and the Greeks, people played instruments to aid in performances. But since the invention of film and cameras and movies, obviously we remember silent films when it was just music and there was no speaking. But let's, fast forward to the 30s to the 50s. And basically all of Western films or films in the United States were accompanied by classical music. And they were pretty, not unique. They were kind of a background to the movie. They weren't trying to add anything, substantial. It was more just to kind of give a subtle emotional cue rather than anything crazy that we kind of see today. Professor James Knipling from University of Cincinnati said that this orchestral sound was pretty universal, like I was saying earlier, and that this kind of like classical score was pretty standard. So let's talk about some things that film composers did. So this was called the Invisible Era. So every aspect of the film, other than the acting, was pretty kind of was apart from the actual movie, if that makes sense. So basically the cinematography and the music wasn't supposed to kind of draw your eye. You were supposed to be like completely engulfed in the film rather than like, oh, that was an interesting cinematic shot, or oh, wow, this music is really overwhelming. It's supposed to be kind of just like a picture frame to the movie. So there's a technique called Mickey Mousing, which is named because it kind of resembles how music is in cartoons, where the composition would kind of mimic things you see on screen. Like a famous example is from like the picture I have here was from American Psycho. Psycho. If you've seen it, there's a famous shower scene where one of the characters is getting like brutally murdered, and the music is lined up with the stabbing, and it's a very abrupt, but it kind of replicates what's happening on screen. And something else that was common during that era that is very common even today and never really fell out of favor is this thing called leitmotifs, which is basically the association of a musical chord or musical kind of identification with a character. And we see that today. So now there was a shift to pop music around the 1960s that kind of moved away from this kind of standard classical scoring to using pop music. A great example of this would be Quentin Tarantino or Wes Anderson, if you like kind of those more indie films. So moving on, Hans Zimmer. So Hans Zimmer, cool guy, was born in Frankfurt, Germany in 1957. And right off the bat, he was kind of exposed to music, taking piano lessons, but he didn't really enjoy taking piano lessons. I'm under the assumption that he was bored with them. But basically, his father died when he was very young, and he states that he used music expression to kind of overcome that grief and that, sadness. And so at age 6, he says that he's taking composing more seriously. And, in and out of school, he moved to London from Germany, and he didn't really want to focus on his studies. He much would rather, focus on his composition and his music. And so, but he did graduate from school. Once he finished school, he wrote jingles for various commercials, and he toured with a rock band. And in the 70s, he was in, he played the synthesizer and the piano and did that, digital age 80s sound that we all know. And then in the late 80s, he was contacted by the director of a movie called Rain Man to do his film score. And I guess the rest is history. So since then, Zimmer has composed over 100 film scores and helped collaborate with Ridley Scott and other famous directors. And he even, shortly after, made his own production company that is pretty successful now. So let's get into why we're here, the Braam. So the Braam is that kind of very identifiable new Hollywood sound, this deep brass, intense sound that kind of accompanies most action movies or intense scenes. Let's go ahead and watch it briefly.
Unknown surface contact.
That noise,
Some kind of
which has been coined as the Braam. So Zimmer coined this kind of very standard Hollywood sound that today in the Inception of Inception. It's very common in that movie. It's very common in the commercial for that movie. And in most Zimmer soundtracks, you can kind of hear this very trademark sound. It's very otherworldly. It's very impactful. People often describe it as like it's not really in the realm of music, but it's not really in the realm of the movie either. So it's kind of this very like ambiguous, intense sound. And this really contrasts what I was talking about earlier in, early 20th century films. There was this very like simple orchestra and it didn't draw that much attention. This claims your attention. And some critiques of this composition style is that it's very artificial, it's very digital. Zimmer is kind of known for his more economic film scoring by layering digital sounds and not necessarily taking advantage of like a full orchestra. But everybody knows the sound. Hans Zimmer coined it. It's kind of everywhere in Hollywood now, and that's kind of the whole point. So now let's get into a specific song that's kind of, just the piano version of one of his like famous scores. So Interstellar, if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's a great film. To the right, we have the piano arrangement of the piece. Obviously, in the full score, there's a lot of extra sounds. It's like a full orchestra. It's very impressive, very overwhelming, very beautiful. So let's listen to a little piece of it. I'm gonna go ahead and skip. A little farther. So basically, what you're hearing here is very standard Hans Zimmer. You start out with a very simple kind of motif or repetition of these simple kind of chords and notes, and then through layering, you get this beautiful texture and you get these crazy dynamics, and it's very impactful. So in this particular piece, you kind of see this, bass dotted half notes throughout, and it kind of reiterates this kind of like simple motif, and the whole piece is layered by these like quick eighth notes, and it kind of gives a feeling of hope, but also anxiety and perseverance. And this whole really song kind of encapsulates like the human condition, and it's very beautiful. But yeah, so Hans Zimmer's scores are generally kind of these simple motifs with repetition, lots of layering to give texture, and by layering I mean the layering of sounds. In piano, you have your bass and your treble, and the layering of those is like very simple but also very beautiful. But in his whole main theme accompanied by the orchestra, it's very dimensional. You have the brass and you have a lot of other aspects to the sound, and it's very impactful. So there is this phrase called cathartic ostinato, An ostinato is basically what I've been describing. It's like a repeated phrase or motif throughout the song, and the catharsis comes from the satisfying nature in which it builds. It's very impactful. And so that's Interstellar, although I don't have the Braam here. It is throughout most of his films. And I think the way he uses simplicity, the way Zimmer uses simplicity and digital, digital music and sound kind of has created this like new wave of film scores and composition. That's not necessarily pop music, but is more modern. And I could go on forever. There's a lot to notice about his pieces, his particular song, or any of his other works with Inception, The Dark Knight Rises. He's done a lot of film scores. Let's move on. This is a quote by Hans Zimmer. A good score should have a point of view all of its own. It should transcend all that has gone before, stand on its own 2 feet, and still serve the movie. A great soundtrack is all about communicating with the audience, but we all try to bring something extra to the movie that is not entirely evident on screen. So this really contrasts the whole notion of early film scores. It's very impactful. It's meant to draw your attention. It's supposed to add more than a picture can show, which I think he absolutely does. Here are my sources. Here's Hans Zimmer doing what he does. Thank you.